One of the 5 faith commitments of Augustana College is a commitment to social justice. Excerpts from that commitment read as follows. Augustana College encourages the development of a campus community that seeks justice, loves kindness, and acts with love and humility. We commit to making our campus and the wider world a more livable place for all persons by loving and serving our neighbor and by acting against injustice and intolerance. Through student groups, offices, and programs, Augustana shows students ways to serve others and to advocate for justice and peace. We seek to embody the ideals of justice, peace, civility, and love in our institutional practices and relationships, to develop fair and charitable practices shaping how we relate to each other. The actions outlined in this commitment may make achieving justice sound easy. It sounds like if we're nice to one another and exercise the golden rule to treat others as you like to be treated, that justice will be achieved in society. While that's a little easier said than done when we consider how some members of society were excluded from fully participating in society and how they didn't have similar rights and access to social goods as others, and limitations were placed on their contributions that influence how society functions and meets the needs of its members. So let's start with the question, what is justice? Justice is a concept that, in its broadest sense, contends that people get what they deserve. It requires ensuring and protecting basic human rights for the most vulnerable people in society. Justice really has to do with making sure that people's needs are met, and all members of society, including the social systems like government, laws, our economy, and education, are in some way responsible to meet this universal goal. Think of it this way. Human needs require or demand social response. There are quite a few theories of justice, and I'm going to focus on the crux of just 3 of them. John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, John Rawls' theory of justice, and thirdly, a theology of liberation by Father Gustavo Gutierrez. Each of these 3 highlight 3 core principles or considerations for justice. 1, personal and social well-being. 2, social institutions ought to be fair and equitable. And 3, if justice is not woven into our social institutions, then injustice will prevail. John Stuart Mill, for example, proposes utilitarianism, which promotes that the right thing to do in any society is what produces the most good. He posits that our actions, the decisions we make, how we treat individuals and communities, should protect the well-being of society. Whatever results in the greatest good overall is just, according to Mill. Another theory of justice comes from John Rawls. He calls this a theory of distributive justice. According to Rawls, each person has an equal right to society's goods and services. Furthermore, if any inequity exists, then it should benefit everyone. Pretty complex, right? Well, not so much according to Rawls. Rawls gives great consideration to the least advantaged in society, and this is where the principle of equity comes in, instead of equality. Within this theory of distributive justice, equal distribution of resources should benefit the least advantaged or the lesser advantaged in any society. A good example of this might be merit-based or needs-based aid. Colleges across the United States offer both merit and needs-based scholarships. Merit-based scholarships are often focused on recognition of student achievements, so academics, athletics, artistic achievements, and some other areas. Needs-based scholarships are offered based on demonstrated financial need. The latter considers family finances and other factors to determine scholarship amounts. The consideration of the need in this way fits Rawls' supposition that unequal distribution of society's resources should benefit the least or the lesser advantaged, the less fortunate. According to Rawls, social institutions ought to be fair and equitable. In other words, getting what one deserves. That members of society are entitled to social goods and services is inherent in this principle of justice. Rawls suggests not only that society should meet the needs of its individual members, he also places a strong and clear emphasis on maximizing the well-being of the poor, or again, the least or the lesser advantaged or unfortunate. Similar to Rawls, Father Gustavo Gutierrez, in A Theology of Liberation, focuses a lens of justice for the poor. Gutierrez claims injustice is not simply a condition or circumstance. It's structured and institutionalized. He says it is systematized. So what does this mean? It means that the same social systems that are necessary for society to function can create disparity or further disadvantage the already disadvantaged. How can the government, the application or the enforcement of laws, or our economy and education system create disparity or further disadvantage people? Competing interests. Successful business owners want and need to make a profit. So that's fair, right? Some would argue, and many would agree, that owners should earn more than their employees. But let's consider earnings. What is a fair wage? Is it the federal minimum wage, $7.25 an hour? Or something else, like a living wage, which is determined by the average cost to live in a particular area? Many states have adopted minimum wages. All of them are higher than the federal minimum. Not as many have adopted a living wage. The minimum wage has not kept pace with the rate of inflation, so wages or earnings remain stagnant and the cost of living increases. If we do not address the minimum wage in the United States, we will create a permanent underclass, a population of residents who continue to struggle to make ends meet. Gutierrez's theory of liberation views justice through the lens of society's marginalized populations, economically and politically. The goal of justice in this theory is to achieve fairness in social institutions through equitable practices. Justice is a complex concept that only makes sense if we agree that injustice exists. Justice focuses on well-being of society, access to social goods and services, and equitable distribution of those goods and services. It really is about fairness. In achieving fairness, one must consider equality and equity with the goal of lessening disparities between populations so that we can all fully participate in society by having similar access to all that society has to offer. And justice also considers outcomes. Are people receiving similar benefit from society's offerings? Are some worse off as a result of their engagement in social systems? Are the outcomes so different for certain populations that they're disadvantaged in some way or placed at a greater disadvantage? Always of concern is who doesn't have enough, whose circumstance is ignored, whose voice is at risk of being silenced. Lots of questions go into what is justice. It's a hard concept to answer, but I think we often know what injustice looks like, when things don't seem to be fair, when they're unequal, when they're inequitable. It's really easy to pick out injustices, but a little harder to explain what justice is. So, what are some contemporary social justice issues? I think about a few, and I want to share them with you. The COVID-19 pandemic has triggered a historic economic downturn, leaving millions of Americans unemployed. Families are concerned about paying their power bill, purchasing necessities, and even losing their housing. Black Lives Matter protests have reignited discussions about systemic racism, inequality, and police reform. Long-term issues like food insecurity, underemployment, calls for living wages instead of a minimum wage, climate change, and climate justice. These are all still ongoing and enduring issues. There's a few more. Voting rights, for example. Equal access to voting has been a long-standing issue. Understanding the barriers that can hold back low-income households, even college students and senior citizens, and minorities and many others are important. These obstacles can include difficult voter registration, shortened early voting windows, and more strict identification requirements. Another contemporary social justice issue is climate injustice. Climate justice is one of our greatest challenges. The effects of climate change are all over the news. The wildfires in California, drastic temperature changes across the United States, and record-breaking temperatures in the Arctic. Climate change isn't a problem just for scientists. Climate change is an issue for all of us to address. Thirdly is health care. Health impacts your quality of life. Access to basic health care is a basic human need. The Affordable Care Act passed in 2010 ensured access to many Americans who previously did not have health insurance. There are still gaps in coverage, particularly with mental health resources. And now, the Affordable Care Act is under threat. If it is dismantled, many Americans will lose coverage, and those with pre-existing conditions can be denied insurance coverage once again. 2020 alone has shown just how vital access to health care really is, as many communities struggle to access tests, treatment, and mental health professionals. The refugee crisis is another contemporary social justice issue. Immigration has been a long-standing issue. The refugee crisis has dominated headlines in the past 2 to 3 years, and it remains a critical issue for those impacted. Whether it's escaping conflict in their own country or natural disaster, refugees are facing daunting challenges. Safety and security are paramount, and other resources are just as pressing. Additionally, access to education, health care, and job opportunities are pretty pressing too. According to the United Nations, more people than ever live in a different country than the one where they were born. Nearly 30 million of them are refugees, and more than half of the globe's refugees are under 18 years old. When people are displaced like this, the challenges are daunting. Racism is a long-standing history in the United States, and racial injustice continues to be a problem. Racism has a long-standing history in the United States. Racial justice is another contemporary justice issue. Its impact can be found in every facet of education, business, employment opportunities, encounters with the police, media portrayals, and just day-to-day life. Stop and frisk laws that are more heavily concentrated in communities of color that result in higher rates of police contact just for being in the community. Stereotypes that impact hiring. Higher concentrations of poverty. There are devastating and long-term consequences of racial injustice on the mental health and physical health of individuals. For decades, individuals and organizations have worked to support federal legislation that would address systemic racism. More recently, organizations have vocalized support to expand legislation, including police reform. The income gap is another issue. A recent federal report found that in 2018, America's income gap was the largest it's ever been in 50 years. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, that divide will most likely be larger. Pay disparities can be a factor on both race and gender and sexuality. Pay gaps exist between different race populations, and a gender pay gap exists where there is a significant difference in how men and women are compensated for the same work. Correlated with income gaps is hunger and food insecurity. Even before the pandemic, Feeding America found that 37 million Americans regularly face hunger and 38 million live in poverty. Food insecurity is a persistent, stubborn issue to solve. So as unemployment rises and many schools remain closed, those who normally access food through food banks and free school lunches will find it even more difficult to meet their needs. Equality is an issue that pervades nearly all other social issues presented, whether it's related to finances or access to resources. It's also become painfully more relevant as the COVID-19 pandemic impacts marginalized communities at higher rates both economically and medically. The list of social justice issues in the United States and around the globe can seem overwhelming, but only if we let them overwhelm us. We each have a role in creating the places we want to exist, and so I encourage you to choose one, just one. Learn about it and get involved. Act for justice. Join the fight against injustice.